obviously the purpose of this is to come up with wise public policy. Thank you very much for your testimony. And the thought occurs to me that it isn't just abstract. Mr. Bryce, you make an incredibly good point that lower income Americans, Britons, Germans, you name it, are the ones bearing the price for decisions made that somehow think they know better what's better for that person as opposed to their basic pocketbook. I'll also point out that we are, if you will, in a counterpoint when we discuss energy policy with both foreign policy as well as environmental policy, specifically greenhouse gas emissions. So with that, it is kind of a setup. And I'll point out that the environmental left has wished to have higher energy costs in an effort to transition to a lower fossil fuel future. And the irony, of course, is now the left wishes to retain our exports, in effect, the same effect as if we'd had increased drilling, because they wish to offset the stated goal of their policy. Now, there's a lot of craziness here. It's just crazy. Mr. Gould, first with you. Mr. Gould, I think you're conflating when you say the Nordic countries have invested more in renewables and therefore have more stable electrical prices. I think what you really mean is that they are using hydropower. And that hydropower, yes, is renewable. It is not what we typically think of in our conversations of wind or solar. It is hydropower. Is that a correct interpretation of what you're saying?
The Nordic countries have invested heavily in hydropower alongside other renewables, yes.
Yes, and the hydropower is what is giving them the stable prices and the lower prices than elsewhere, because we've already spoken of the wind drought. In fact, I was trying to look, but no one's done a relationship, perhaps one of you will, that one of the reasons that England is paying such a high price for gas is that they had betted on North Sea winds always blowing. There's been a wind drought. Wind was 34% of their electrons. Then they went through a 6-month period of getting none. They had not invested in storage for natural gas. And so paradoxically, or maybe not, there's a direct relationship between betting on renewables and paying a heck of a lot more for natural gas. Now, this is just kind of short-sighted policy that is both bad for the consumer, but it's also bad for international global greenhouse gas emissions because now they and others are burning more coal. So I would point out that when we think about our policies, we actually have to think about them second and third degree, not just congratulate us on things which sound good when we first pass it. Mr. Bryce, when Senator Heinrich talked about the levelized price of renewables, he did not include the cost of the backup peaker plants or other fossil fuel generation required, because obviously you can't store electrons from wind and from solar. If you include that cost of the required backup baseload natural gas, whatever, peaker plants, within the cost of the renewable, what would be the cost of that renewable relative to natural gas?
Well, sir, I don't have those numbers at hand. What I do know is that whatever renewable capacity is added, it doesn't mean you can retire all of the thermal generation that is needed during peak times of peak demand. And the Senator Heinrich didn't allow me to respond to it, but that was clearly the case in Texas, where when the grid was on the verge of collapse, and it was, as Bill Magnus, former CEO of ERCOT, said on February 25th, it was within 4 or 5 minutes of total collapse. So if you think about that, and you think about a grid that is heavily reliant on renewables that cannot deliver power when power is dear, and 25 million Texans in the ERCOT market could have been put into darkness, we wouldn't have had 700 people die, sir. It would have been in the tens of thousands.
So let me ask you this, Mr. Bryce. I said this is a counterpoint argument, both with global greenhouse gas emissions, but also with national security. You pointed out that the supply chains for the batteries required for renewables to store their electrons come out of China. Either they are mined by Chinese companies or they are processed in China, often using coal as a feedstock for the energy required. What does this do to our national security to be dependent upon China for our batteries as opposed to having the alternative, which is using natural gas, et cetera?
Senator, it's not just the batteries. It's the neodymium, the other rare earth elements that are in that are considered the green elements, the lanthanides. China has a 90% share of that market globally. I'd point you to the report that the IEA did in May on this, which laid this case out very clearly. And in Mr. Gould's testimony, his written testimony, he pointed to this critical minerals issue. So the idea that we're going to make a quick transition away from hydrocarbons to alternative technologies hinges on a massive increase in mining. And it's not just of rare earth elements, it's manganese, zinc, copper, cobalt, an enormous array of minerals. And the question is, well, where are we going to mine them? And the Senate, I know this committee has had hearings on increasing mining in the U.S., but my guess is the Sierra Club is not going to be pushing for a lot of that mining.
I thank you. I yield back, and I will point out that if this hearing is a counterpoint to both greenhouse gas emissions, environmental policy, and as well as foreign policy and national security, it's a great hearing, let me say that, but I think maybe another to interweave those two. Because if we look at energy as an isolated issue, we're going to end up far worse in both the global greenhouse gas emissions and in terms of our national security. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Good recommendation, Senator. Senator Murkowski.
Thank you, Mr.